thought I'd do another presentation on how you might answer a question on comparative poetry from the Power and Conflict cluster. So let's say, for the purpose of today's session, our focus is compare the way the poet presents loss in Kamikaze and one other poem you have studied from Power and Conflict. So let's start with that focus, loss. What does loss actually mean to you? By thinking about it like this, it will help us to create those big ideas or come up with the overall ideas first before thinking about methods or the way in which the poet has done that. So loss could be a loss of weight, could be losing a gain, could be a loss of control, anything from a loss of light to loss of life, anything that loss means to you. Really great place to start. Now let's think of a poem that we could use to compare to Kamikaze. Poppies, written by Jane Weir, is a compassionate poem about the wider implications of war and the suffering it causes, particularly to those closest to the soldiers. Jane Weir herself is a contemporary poet, and actually you could argue that this poem is about conflict and could refer to any war, although it was written when men were still dying in Afghanistan, and women. And actually this could be a way of expressing the suffering and grief caused by those deaths. So let's remind ourselves of the poem itself. As we read, really think about loss. Where is the loss in this poem?
3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias, binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, stilled the softening on my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when we were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through your gelled, black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from a pear tree, and this is where it had led me. Skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the wall memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind.
Okay, so these aren't the absolute answers, these are just examples. 4 points you could have come up with could have been, there's a loss of life. Poppies themselves are a symbol of loss and death, and they're also a reminder of those that have lost their lives. Could also say that actually in this, there's a real sense of a loss of innocence or perhaps a loss of childhood, particularly through the son himself and the way in which the mother recounts those happier days when he was a child. There's a definite loss of control here. The internal pain and struggle to stay collected and controlled is not just inferred in the metaphor, but also through the enjambment and sporadic use of caesura. It's as if the mother herself is trying to resist the pain of losing her son. Finally, we could say that actually by the end there's an acceptance of loss. Although wishing he were still alive, the dove, which is a biblical reference, is symbolic of a new beginning and also signifies the acceptance of newfound freedom, both for the mother and her son. So let's compare those 4 points to Kamikaze. So Garland herself is also a contemporary poet. And this poem explores a testimony of the daughter of a kamikaze pilot. It focuses on the consequence of turning back from the kamikaze mission and also shows how society would have rejected and isolated anybody who did this. Again, we'll remind ourselves of the poem. As we do, think about those overall points of loss that we just came up with for Poppies. Could we use those direct points of comparison for this poem as well? Here we go.
Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in the swathes, like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other, in a figure of 8, the dark shoal of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cans of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat safe to the shore. Salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait and once tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chatted and laughed, till gradually we too learnt to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die.
So we thought about a loss of life. Is there a loss of life here? Well, yes, actually, the pilot has metaphorically lost his life as a result of his decision to turn back, perhaps. He questions whether dying would have actually been the better option. We could also argue that there is an acceptance of loss, particularly found at the end of Poppies. Here, the family cannot accept his decision to turn back, and the pilot struggles to accept death in regards to his mission. Some kind of acceptance, perhaps indifference to the acceptance of loss in Poppies. We definitely also get a loss of control here, or actually, he arguably gains control by opposing the authority and not completing the suicide mission. However, in gaining control over his life, he loses the control over his family and his place within society. A point of comparison there. Finally, there is also arguably a sense of a loss of innocence or childhood innocence. There's a real remembrance in this, a real nostalgic moment. The innocence of his childhood memory triggered the place beneath him. This contrasts the particularly harrowing moment in his own childhood, conforming to society's need to ostracise their own father who turned back from this kamikaze mission. So again, this isn't the only way you can write a comparative paragraph, but a really good way of thinking about it. So in your main point, in your topic sentence, you cover both poems. What do both poets aim to do, and how do they do that? You then go on to give evidence and analysis from your first poem, link that to your second poem, and then try and summarise at the end. Now, there is nothing to say that you cannot be comparing throughout. So perhaps in your first poem analysis, you might pop in some ideas about how it can compare similarly or in contrast to your second poem. Absolutely fine. So a good example could look like this.
As always, I hope that was useful and you learnt something new. Happy revising!